right, welcome back. And let's continue into our next segment of the program. One of the pleasures of organizing an event like this is that I get to meet and bring in magnificent scholars on whose work I have relied from time to time, and who I have read with great pleasure over the years. And our keynote speaker, our guest today, is one of those persons who I'm very happy to welcome to New Bedford. Although I understand he's been here before at least a couple of times and knows our community fairly well. Fergus Bordewich is the author of, and the reason that he is joining us today is because he's the author of one of the best general books on the Underground Railroad, called Bound for Caanan, The Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America, which was named one of the New York Public Library's best books, 10 best books of the year in 2005 when it came out. Mr. Bordewich has been an independent writer and a historian and a journalist since the early 1970s. His articles have appeared in many national magazines and newspapers, and his book reviews appear regularly in the Wall Street Journal. He holds a degree from the City College of New York and from Columbia University. He has written 7 additional nonfiction books, including the following: Congress at War, How Republican Reformers Fought the Civil War, Defied Lincoln, Ended Slavery, and Remade America. He has also written The First Congress, How James Madison, George Washington, and a Group of Extraordinary Men Invented the Government, which was the winner. This book was the winner of the D.B. Handeman Prize in American History. And also America's Great Debate, Henry Clay, Stephen Douglas, and the Compromise That Preserved the Union, which was the winner of the 2012 Los Angeles Times History Prize. In 2015, he served as chairman of the awards committee for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, given by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Mr. Bordewich recently completed a book about the federal government's struggle to defeat the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, and it will be published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2023, in the coming year. He lives now in Washington, D.C., with his wife, Jean Parvin Bordewich, an advisor to philanthropies on democratic governance, and who is also a playwright. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome, and I hope you'll join me in warmly welcoming Fergus Bordewich to our podium. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I assume so. Good morning, everyone. Well, as Tim said, I have been here before in New Bedford, a wonderful city. And I came here to walk the Underground Railroad routes years ago. Before beginning, I want to thank the New Bedford Historical Society and the Whaling Museum and the University of Massachusetts, and personally Tim Walker and also Lee Blake for making this possible for me to be here and for making this entire conference possible, which I assume you all know, because you're here, is a terrific breakthrough in the study of the Underground Railroad, the conference and the book that it's based on. When I wrote Bound for Caanan almost 20 years ago, research into the seagoing underground was in its a contradiction in terms, seagoing underground, okay, but the terms are a little awkward, but there we are. Was in its comparatively early stages. Some had been written, but not a great deal. And it was not well understood even by historians. Sailing to Freedom has opened wide a door into an aspect of freedom-seeking and anti-slavery radicalism that even those of us who've read and thought seriously about the Underground Railroad have only sketchily understood. And it's truly an excellent book, full of revelatory information, and highly readable also, by the way. And I urge those of you who haven't read it already to do so. I don't think any aspect of American history has been more obscured by myth or confused by myth than the Underground Railroad. For generations, in the absence of adequate information about the Underground's real history, all kinds of fantasies flourished about hidden tunnels and exotic hiding places and cryptic codes and secret maps, all sorts of things like that. About 30 years ago or thereabouts, when my wife and I were house hunting in New York's Hudson Valley, I don't know how many properties we looked at where the real estate agent said, and this is where they hid the fugitive slaves. You know, it was a dumbwaiter in one house, and it was a potato seller in another house, and there was even a guy in the area, well-meaning gentleman, who gave tours of Underground Railroad escape routes that included drainage tunnels built in the 1950s. So, I mean, it's only in the absence of true information that fantasies like this can flourish. And for the most part, these and the more serious myths of the Underground Railroad were the inventions of white Americans who were captivated by the Underground's aura of drama and mystery and turned vague local stories, some with perhaps a grain of truth, many with no truth at all, into fact-free legends that illuminated little and obscured a great deal. The complex reality of the Underground Railroad was much more significant than the sum of its fictions. I want to emphasize here, and I will probably reiterate this, the Underground Railroad isn't about tunnels and funky hiding places. It's about human beings. It's about people. It is about the relationships among different kinds of people, about human self-sacrifice and human character. It's about what people did. Both those, always at the center, you have to think of the fugitive, the freedom seeker, and also self-sacrificing individuals of many types who assisted those freedom seekers. That's the Underground Railroad. It's the human dimension, not the tunnels. There were no tunnels, by the way. The truth of the Underground Railroad wasn't lost because the Underground was so secret. It wasn't, at least in the North. Frederick Douglass famously complained in print that so much of its activity was widely known that it ought to be called the Overground Railroad. Records of underground work survive from some of its agents, most notably William Still, who's been mentioned already, in Philadelphia, and by the way, whose excellent book is highly readable. It's been reprinted in cheap editions, and most of it's available online as well. It's very accessible for anybody. I gather high school students here. You can go into that material and it will fascinate you. This isn't musty, dusty records. I love musty, dusty records, by the way. I'm an historian. But it's highly, highly approachable by readers, serious readers of all kinds. Anyway, records also survive from other cities as well, although none are as detailed as Still's. A great deal of information about the workings of the Underground can also be found in activists' memoirs, letters, obituaries, anti-slavery newspapers of the period, and the wonderful archives or collection of Professor Wilbur Siebert at the Ohio Historical Society. He's been mentioned also. Virtually all of the collection, I think, or a great deal of it, is now online. It used not to be when I was writing my book. It now is. It's marvelous material. Yes, aspects of his scholarship can be challenged. I mean, you'd think, the center of the Underground Railroad was the state of Ohio, which was very important, by the way. Siebert lived in Ohio. He had much better information there. So it's not balanced geographically or racially, I should say. Much heavier on white activists and thin on black activists. But Fascinating material. Anyway, the Underground's real history was willfully and systematically forgotten and erased during the Jim Crow era, when the significance of a movement in which blacks and whites worked together and in which in many areas was organized by African Americans, or was almost entirely African American, was deliberately suppressed by reactionary historians and overt white supremacists. And bear in mind, we use the word white supremacist today in a very pejorative way, justifiably. In the 19th century, in the early 20th century, people were proud of it. You know, this is a common term. And it was, in fact, the motto of, I believe, the Alabama Democratic Party until about 1960. Okay? It was a respectable term. Anyway, so one of the boldest, most far-reaching grassroots movement in the country's history morphed into this essentially colorful folktale. And historians, when they alluded to the Underground Railroad at all, virtually without exception, portrayed it as a story of kindly white philanthropists offering help to hapless and helpless black people. You get the racial slant. Well into our own time, and even now, I suppose, popular culture has embraced this bouquet of allegedly coded map songs that are said to have transmitted directions for long-distance overland routes that freedom seekers could follow. The best known of these songs, Follow the Drinking Gourd, was at least partly, if not entirely, fabricated by an early 20th century folklorist and then revised by the white singer Lee Hayes in the 1940s and popularized by the Weavers and Pete Seeger. All well-intentioned, but that's where it came from. And as recently as the 1990s, the totally baseless idea that certain antebellum quilts contained secret maps gained popular currency. Quilting historians have totally debunked this by showing that the patterns alleged to comprise the maps actually date from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the legend, like so many underground legends, still persists. And talk about fictionalizing the Underground Railroad, a popular young adult biography of Harriet Tubman, I think from the 1970s, maybe the early 80s, even used a white model for its cover, okay? Because the artist, I met him, he's a nice guy, but clueless. Because the artist deemed the real Harriet Tubman not attractive enough. You can't make this stuff up, but but it was. Anyway, myths can be emotive and they're inspiring, and they certainly have engaged a lot of interest in the idea of the Underground Railroad. But they certainly don't help us understand the real experiences of fugitives or the way in which the Underground actually worked. So, what are we actually talking about when we talk about the Underground Railroad? Tim addressed this as well, and I'm going to now. Its definition is somewhat elusive. In its narrowest sense, it was a coordinated system by means of which freedom-seeking fugitives were directed or carried by radical black and white abolitionists from the upper edge of the South to safe havens in the North and Canada. Some argue that this system, and it was a system, it wasn't random. There was an Underground Railroad that was not random. It was a system. Came into being only after the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society in the 1830s, which systematically organized it as the society spread across the free states. That's one point of view. Others, with whom I agree, by the way, maintain with a great deal of evidence that its roots clearly reach back at least into the late 18th century. More generally, the term can be expansively applied to any random assistance at all of whatever kind, however spontaneous, that was offered to fugitive slaves anywhere from the eastern seaboard to the Texas frontier. But both these meanings have some validity. They're both reasonable ways to describe the Underground Railroad. And personally, I really think that finding the right definition is less important than the discussion we have about it, and exploring how these multifarious things that are folded into the Underground Railroad worked and what the people were like who participated in it. I really don't care whether, my take is the definitive one. I do have an opinion on this, but which is boldly added to and challenged, in fact, by this great book and this conference. When 19th century Americans, the underground's own activists, the contemporaries, their enemies and others, used the term, and they used it frequently by the 1840s and 50s, they were talking about a loosely organized web of subversive abolitionists that spread across the northern states and into the northerly edge of the upper South, and included free blacks, whites, and at least some enslaved collaborators. For the purpose of this talk, I'll refer to this just as the Northern Underground. The Northern Underground, to distinguish it from what today's speakers will make clear was a rather different pattern of underground activity along the Atlantic coast, what Tim has already addressed. And I'm going to say now, and I may repeat this, you've seen maps of what purport to represent the Underground Railroad, including a truly, Tim showed you one of them, or two maps, one of them particularly during his talk that derived from National Geographic, I think was published probably in the 1970s, with these big arrows going this way and that way, and this big fat arrow going up the Mississippi River and here and there, even to St. Paul, Minnesota for some reason, I don't know why. And erase that map from your mind. It is of no value. There's almost no truth to it, except by accident, okay? It misrepresents where freedom seekers traveled and fails to note where a great deal of them moved, okay? But it's indicative of the kind of cobwebs that we have to sweep away because we really, in order to really understand the workings of the Underground Railroad. Okay. Like Tim, I should emphasize that from the earliest years of settlement and slavery, enslaved men and women fled from their bondage whenever they could. And they would sometimes be helped by other former slaves, white friends, and Native Americans. The Northern Underground, as I described it before, arose in the late 18th century, documentably, from the synergy between free blacks and anti-slavery Quakers, mainly around Philadelphia, where they pioneered strategies that would gradually spread wherever the underground operated on land, such as the use of multiple safe houses disguised as long-distance transportation of fugitives, and so on. The great majority of white activists, I'm going to make a distinction here, were driven by a spiritual imperative. It comes out of the churches. It comes out first from Quakers, then of the evangelical Christian churches. A spiritual imperative that proclaimed slavery to be a sin that could only be eradicated by personal action. In the words of one operative, if by doing my duty and endeavoring to fulfill the injunctions of the Bible, I injured my business, then let my business go. Black activists, many of them former slaves themselves, were most often motivated by a desire to free family members or friends, or by bitter memory of their own degradation in slavery. Jermaine Logan, a remarkable man whom we all ought to know as well as we know Frederick Douglass, who escaped from servitude in Tennessee, wrote to Frederick Douglass, both of them in New York State at the time, "Had I not been terribly wronged, as you and all our race, I think I should have been a very still, quiet man. Oppression has made me mad. It has waked up all my intellectual and physical energies." It's one of the most powerful statements of underground activist motivation I've ever come across, and I think it should be engraved in granite somewhere. By the 1840s, the Northern Underground was a diverse and flexible interlocking system that operated with a great deal of efficiency, but without central control. There was never any president or general manager, nor was there any governing hierarchy. In practice, it was a model of democracy in action. As a station master in Ohio, a man named Isaac Beck, very expressive man, put it, there was no regular organization, no constitution, no officers, no laws or agreement or rule except the golden rule, and every man did what seemed right in his own eyes. In the North, the Underground Railroad also included a human infrastructure of lawyers who were willing to defend fugitives, businessmen who provided funds, as well as an even wider pool of family members, friends, and fellow parishioners, black and white, who, though they might never engage personally in illegal activity, protected those who did and made it possible for the others to continue their work. And in New York, and upstate New York, New England, New Bedford, the upper Midwest, it was barely hidden at all. In Syracuse, New York, Jermaine Logan, who was a station master there, even advertised his home in local newspapers as the main underground station in the city. You can read the ads. If you've made it to Syracuse and you can read, you look at the newspaper. There's Jermaine Logan's ad. This is his address. Go there. Clothing and shelter. Anyway, this is pretty much what 19th century Americans and most later historians were thinking of when they talked about the Underground Railroad. So most writing about the Underground Railroad took comparatively little notice, if any, other than the anecdotal and of the possibly vast number of successful escapes via the Atlantic and Gulf Coast or the Mississippi and other rivers. In my own book, I wrote at some length about one story. It's anecdotal, but very well documented, of the Yankee seaman Jonathan Walker, the man with the branded hand. And you can see an engraving of the hand, SS for slave stealer. He was caught trying to sail a group of freedom seekers from Pensacola, Florida, to the British island of the Bahamas. He said, not slave stealer, slave savior. Anyway, in retrospect, having been read a great deal since my book came out, I realized I could have done a lot more with this subject. I have found some of the research in Sailing to Freedom, frankly, revelatory. It's especially, bringing together things we only half knew before into a coherent whole. This book and the conference today amply demonstrate that there was a glaring and not insignificant omission in the whole way we've talked about the Underground Railroad. Some of these flights via the saltwater flights had links with the Northern Underground and delivered freedom seekers directly into its hands, but other aspects were significantly different. For example, while there were well-established connections between the local underground in Norfolk, Virginia, and William Still's anti-slavery office in Philadelphia, freedom seekers commonly had to pay their way onto ships, willing to risk carrying them north. Such transactional deals were, by all accounts, pretty rare, very rare, on the Overland Underground Railroad. Now, this subject, Norfolk, the Norfolk region, is going to be discussed in detail by Cassandra Newby-Alexander today. So you're going to hear a lot more about that. So I won't elaborate myself. The coastal underground differed in other ways. In his paper on Black Waterman, David Soselsky speaks of the slender threads of collusion woven into the fabric of coastal society that enabled numbers of fugitive slaves to escape from North Carolina via ocean-going ships. I think that it was these slender threads of collusion, it's a great phrase, that characterized the underground, not just around the Atlantic coast ports, but very likely within the slavery-dominated society of the South as a whole. The vast majority of overland freedom seekers came from just 3 states in the Upper South: Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky. And mostly from the very northern edge of those states. Although the fingers of the Northern Underground reached into those areas, just how far and how consistently is still elusive. Slaveholders fantasized a far-flung underground that spread all over the South. It never existed. It did not exist in the Deep South. But I suspect that the nature of the contacts that enabled freedom seekers to reach, say, the Ohio River or Pennsylvania state line, or the port of Charleston, or the port of New Orleans, for that matter, were very likely those slender threads, these linkages, which honestly, we still have to admit, are extremely difficult to research. Extremely difficult. Most intriguing among these are the men and women, some of whom figure prominently in the papers included in today's panels, are those who chose to remain in slavery themselves, even as they helped others toward freedom. These are remarkable people, and in some respects, these are the most heroic members of the Underground Railroad, or participants in underground activity, who stayed in slavery, who themselves could have left because they knew how to do it. And I wrote about 2 such individuals in my own book. They weren't in coastal ports. A man named Arnold Gragston in Kentucky, who was enslaved, but tolerated by his master. Very interesting. I mean, some of their very unusual. Be prepared for the unexpected. If you're researching the Underground Railroad. Tolerated by his master, he rowed fugitives, freedom seekers across the Ohio River to Ohio. And a man who's known only as Hamilton Saul, a slave name. He belonged to Mr. Hamilton in Guilford County, North Carolina, who was the conduit who brought enslaved people to the Coffin family, who were white, and saw that they were guided, carried to Indiana. For decades, this man Saul did this work apparently for decades. He finally did leave, but he remained in slavery until he did leave. Anyway, to identify and unravel these relationships, this kind of collusion, remains extremely difficult, since it was in the slaveholding South that the Underground, however we define it, really was pretty much as secret as the legends claim. Quantifying the effectiveness of the Underground almost everywhere is really still a challenge. Numbers matter because they help to tell us how effective the Underground really was. And we're thwarted at most turns in the road here, because records of the numbers of fugitives handled are sparse, they're fragmentary. They do exist. They do exist. It's possible to extrapolate, but it's hard to draw long-term conclusions. How many fugitives escaped from the South during any given year of a decade, or from any given state? How many actually went to Canada or merely said they were going to Canada? How many remained in the border country, close to the communities that they in fact fled? More than you'd imagine. These are open questions. Personally, I think it's reasonable to suppose that somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 freedom seekers might have passed through the Underground in the decades before the Civil War. It is no more than a guess. It is a guess based on figures that I was able to extrapolate from different places. I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd love to have it proven that it was 500,000. I wouldn't be shocked if it proved to be 50,000. We just don't know. But certainly the traffic, the volume of traffic on the Northern Underground varied a great deal. Some figures are knowable. A man named Elijah Anderson, who conducted fugitives through southern Indiana, estimated that he had about 90 passengers per year in the 1840s. In the mid-1850s, the committee that oversaw underground work in Cleveland, a very active committee, all female, by the way, forwarded 275 fugitives to Canada, an average of not quite one a day. By contrast, a man named Milton Kennedy, who was an ardent abolitionist, who really, really wanted to get people into the free states, he worked on an Ohio River steamboat, very well positioned to do so, was disappointed to encounter just 2 fugitives during years on the river. Go figure, you know. Determining how many left from the Atlantic ports is, on the whole, no less challenging. Norfolk is a little different, and I know that Cassandra will talk about that later today. But it seems clear that many more did so than earlier historians ever supposed. So I think their story, that is to say, freedom seekers leaving through the ports, both broadly speaking and as individual dramas, from now on has to be treated as a major element in Underground Railroad history. And this conference, I'll say again, is in itself a vivid illustration of how fertile a field for groundbreaking new research still lies ahead for the Underground Railroad. Now, comparable research deserves to be done on the Gulf Coast, particularly around ports like Pensacola, New Orleans, Mobile, Gulfport, Galveston, where fugitives were perhaps less likely to be heading north than to the British islands of the Caribbean. Some to Mexico, although I think the number traveling to Mexico, personally, I think has been exaggerated in recent years. But similarly, keeping in mind those slender threads of collusion, a great deal more work remains to be done on waterborne underground activity along the Mississippi River, in the Tennessee River Valley, and elsewhere, other riverine routes of escape, and elsewhere in the northerly regions of the Upper South. And another subject that I think really calls for more attention is the dispersal of freedom seekers in the northern border country, where surprising numbers of fugitives, as I mentioned earlier, chose to settle despite their proximity to the slave states and vulnerability to bounty hunters. One county where I've done a lot of work and know quite well is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which borders Maryland. If you've read, many of you must have, I guess, about the Christiana resistance, used to be called the Christiana riot, when essentially an underground related group of black men and women fought off well, they ambushed actually a slave hunting master and a couple of law officers, killed the master, Mr. Gorsuch. But the southern edge of Lancaster County was dense with a black population composed of fugitives. They're miles. You could just an hour's walk, 2 hours walk from the Maryland state line, and not more than a great many of these folks had been enslaved in Maryland. Yet there they were in the border country of Pennsylvania. Were slave hunters active? Well, yes, but I think we have to ask some fresh questions about why people felt sufficiently safe, and were they why did they feel as safe as they did, and were they as safe as they thought? Mostly yes. So there are lots of questions to be asked that still aren't really being asked in a penetrating way. That said, for those of us who write about the Underground Railroad, we live in a golden age of scholarship and local research. Indeed, a lot of the best research I've seen has come from people working within counties, I mean, it's not at the macro level, in universities where there's great work being done. You're going to hear a lot of it today. But very local, town historians, county historians, regional historians who are burrowing deep into what happened in their own localities. And because the Underground Railroad was so localized, that's where a lot of the material, the fresh material, still lies, I think. I want to call this era that we're in now an era of radical remembering. And yeah, I mean two things by that. We should recognize, one, the political radicalism of what the underground was doing. But I also mean it in the sense of going to the root of what we thought we knew but didn't. And between the watershed work of Wilbur Siebert in the 1890s and the early 21st century, almost no serious history of the Underground Railroad was even attempted. And Siebert, I want to put in another word for him because I think he was unjustly belittled and chiseled down by the historian Larry Garrah in his very early revisionist book, The Liberty Line, which none too soon wrote Black activists back into the Underground Railroad after having been erased, but at the same time, out of I think an overzealous desire to be fair, or ultimately unfair, he wrote whites out of it, intended to discredit Siebert's research. I don't think it should be discredited, especially his early research. The past 2 decades, however, have seen an efflorescence of really excellent work. Kate Clifford Larson's book on Harriet Tubman, Graham Russell Hodges's book on David Ruggles in New York City, and Stan Harold's writing on Washington, D.C., and Keith Griffler in the Ohio River Valley, and William Kashadis in Pennsylvania, among others, many others. Not to mention the contributors to this, to Sailing to Freedom. But most of us, or anyway, some of us, I mean, I'm in the older end of the people in this room, I realize, grew up in an era when the underground was mostly this folktale, and abolitionists were often dismissed as zealots or fanatics. Today, I mean, we not only remember, but happily, we're honoring the radicalism of abolition. I don't just mean kind of facile political radicalism, because for a lot of underground activists, they didn't actually see it as a political movement. They saw it even as, since so many came out of the churches, as actually a spiritual movement, a spiritual activity. And for some, something like prayer in action. I think there's more to be explored about this as well. And there's some debate about the degree to which the underground was driven by religious impulses. I think it was driven a great deal by it. So we not only honor the radicalism of abolition, but we recognize it as a movement of morally courageous Americans, white and black, who galvanized public opposition to slavery. While the myths, tired as they are, still persist, the underground has increasingly been recognized in many areas as primarily an African-American phenomenon, and in the South, to have existed almost wholly within black communities. And increasingly, we've also, at long last, come to recognize the self-emancipating freedom seeker as the central figure in the story of the underground, rather than as an excuse for white philanthropists to do good. At the same time, I think it would be wrong to downplay the fundamental biracial aspect of the underground, especially in the North, obviously, and equally wrong to ignore its political impact on the nation. It was a movement with far-reaching political and moral consequences that did a great deal to help change antebellum America. It was the country's first interracial movement involving free blacks, anti-slavery whites, and slaves. It was the nation's first great movement of civil disobedience since the American Revolution. This is pretty significant. Engaging thousands of citizens, tens of thousands, in the subversion of hated federal and state laws. It was the first American mass movement that asserted the principle of personal active responsibility for others' human rights. It was one of the seedbeds of American feminism, in which both black and white women were often participants on an equal plane with men, sheltering and clothing fugitives, serving as guides, and vigorously insisting that their voices be heard. You should read some of the debates at anti-slavery conferences from women who will not be quiet. Very interesting. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you all know who she was, a great early feminist, was radicalized by sitting at the dinner table with fugitive slaves at her cousin Gerrit Smith's home in upstate New York. She put it this way: woman is more fully identified with the slave than man can possibly be, in the 1840s. So, if the disheartening history of slavery showed white Americans at their worst, the history of the Underground Railroad and the larger abolitionist movement reveals them, white and black alike, at their bravest and best, and as an enduring model of interracial collaboration. Apart from helping tens of thousands of freedom seekers to new lives in safe havens, I think the Underground's greatest achievement may have been its creation of a truly free zone of interracial activity, where more than a century and a half ago, black Americans not only directed complex logistical and financial operations, but also supervised networks that included white men and women who often were accorded no special status because of their color. Talk about radical. We're talking about the 1830s, the 40s, 50s. In our own era of kind of menacing polarization and racial stress, the Underground's history also reminds us that humanist values can prevail over self-serving cynicism and the tyranny of the times, the impulse to tyranny of the times, and said to say, there's so much in the air as I speak in our own moment that's evocative of the worst thinking, the worst attitudes of antebellum times, that it gives one pause if one thinks where humanity is always improving. So the history of slavery, I think it can no longer be argued, is one of the key themes in American history. It's fundamental. It's fundamental. It's one of the central themes, like constitutionalism and the enlargement of human rights and political rights, which happens simultaneously. History is full of contradictions because people are full of contradictions, and society is full of contradictions. You can have contradictory things existing and happening at the same time, our time or other times. And we need to know more about it, more about slavery, not less. I mean, it's very disheartening that there are forces in the country that have decided that we shouldn't really be hearing about slavery because it's unpleasant, because it makes people uncomfortable. Well, history makes people uncomfortable if you pay attention to it. And I mean, there are innumerable ways of talking about this subject. I'm not a polemicist. I'm not. What I really like is I don't mind contention. I don't mind argument. I like debate. Get this history out there and just keep talking and arguing about it. And the truth, as it's wont to do, will steadily percolate into our consciousness. And the story of the Underground Railroad is one of many routes into that history. It's a wonderful route into the history because the collaboration that one sees in the Underground Railroad, spontaneous, planned, coming out of the churches, coming out of no churches, wherever, is a marvelous story. And you're here in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is one of the greatest places in the United States for this story. I mean, this is a heroic place, this little city, with a history so much greater than its mere the size of its population. And it's just, to me as an historian, it is a great thing to see the dynamism of historical work here in New Bedford, the enthusiasm and creativity, imagination, and clarity with which history is presented here. And I'm just going to end by thanking you, New Bedford folks, for doing this. Thanks, everybody.
Good morning, and thank you. I'm curious if you could comment, the fallacy of this sort of continuous northern progression, and I can't but sit here and think in the sailing analogy of we often on a sailing ship don't go straight in a direction. We have to sort of go very far out of our way to reach our final destination. And I'm curious if you could comment both on the land progression in the maritime space of how much sort of going deeper in to get out there may have been, and how we perhaps need to explore this sort of very circuitous route to get us out of this sort of concept image of this sort of just continuous arrow north.
Okay. Well, look, I think freedom seekers took every kind of route you can imagine. Every kind of route you can imagine. A huge number basically walked for one day out of northern Kentucky to the Ohio River, and were rowed across, or picked up a skiff on the shore and rowed themselves across, and it was pretty direct. And there were a lot of the escapes were comparatively direct. On the other hand, as quite a few very interesting references or stories in Sailing to Freedom make clear, in the coastal country, people later, Harriet Jacobs, the famous story of Harriet Jacobs. If you haven't read it, please read it. It is one of the great narratives. Anyway, quite a few freedom seekers laid out, as the term of the time, for a year, months, several years, even waiting for an opportunity. And I don't know, I mean, that may not count as geographically circuitous, but it certainly speaks to the kind of challenges even that freedom seekers faced. I don't know if I'm really addressing what you're asking here, but people certainly tried to go as close to a straight line as they could, but they went where assistance was available if they were traveling in a way that required assistance.
Your idea of radical reflection and the work of Tim and the work of Skip and everything that you guys have been saying has really blown my mind. And I'm wondering, because of your travels and your research, if you've ever come across the idea of repatriation prior Paul Coffey on behalf of the whalers, because there was the prowess and the intelligence of circumnavigation. And all of this research begs us for a different type of reflection. It's almost like the indigenous continent that's coming up now with Pika's book. So I'm wondering, in your travels, because we're not going to get these specialists in front of us like this again, have you come across efforts for repatriation because Black sailors and other like-minded people might have wanted, before Paul Coffey, to return people for repatriation to Africa? Did you ever come across that type of research?
Well, of course, there's a lot to be said on the subject, but and indeed there were. Well, the term of art in the 19th century was colonization, okay, which was supported primarily, American Colonization Association, by white slave owners and certain non-slave owning philanthropists, slave owners, because it was a way to get rid of free Black people, okay? And so it's something that commingled both altruism and cynicism. The colonization movement. Yes, there were Black Americans, free Black Americans, who felt so embittered or hopeless about future in the United States that they, like Paul Coffey, who advocated moving back to Africa. It failed. I mean, as a movement, it failed because Black Americans were Americans, which people like Frederick Douglass repeatedly kept telling the country. We belong here. This is our home, often for generations. The number of Africa-born Black Americans by the couple of decades into the 19th century was very small. It was very small. The overseas slave trade basically ended in 1808. A couple of exceptions, but it basically ended. And you have generations and generations of native-born Black Americans. This is their home. They didn't want to go. They didn't want. This is why. It's really why the Colonization Association failed. People didn't want to leave. Also, besides, it was hellish. Life in Liberia was hellish. You know, the mortality was incredibly high. Some people stayed, but it was a failure. Not because there weren't people trying.
So, Fergus, Professor Walker didn't have time to go over your fuller resume, but one of your earliest books was Killing the White Man's Indian. You obviously have an interest in Native American history. When you were going through Bound to Caanan, did you find anything about the role of Native Americans in the so-called Underground Railroad? If you didn't, can you speculate why? Is it a question of just sources or participation?
Yeah, great question. Very little. There's very little, much less evidence than I think right-minded folks would like to think about Native Americans participating in the liberation of enslaved Americans. Now, there are examples. Wampanoag Indians here in Massachusetts, clearly, and there were. It's also true that in a number of areas of the North, in New York State, Massachusetts, a few other places, Native communities were one of the few places. Bear in mind, these are free states. In free states, one of the few types of communities where Black Americans, otherwise somewhat ostracized, even the North, could find homes and a welcome. Okay. That's not exactly the same as the Underground Railroad, although clearly some fugitives wound up in northern Native communities that were themselves much diminished and welcomed incoming people. Okay, complicated subject, and it's very hard to generalize anywhere, anytime about Native Americans. There are hundreds and hundreds of communities, and Native Americans, or as a whole, exist only as an entity, one entity in the minds of white Americans. Which is to say, you have a multitude of communities and sovereign groups. Okay, here and there, one can find examples of Native groups assisting fugitives. You find just as many instances of Native communities that themselves practiced slavery and enslaved Black fugitives or returned them to their white owners for the bounty. Sad to say, folks, you might not, this may be an unpleasant thing to hear, but it's so, it's documentable. It varied. And indeed, Black Americans often shared exactly the same fears, phobias, paranoia about Indians as white Americans did, because they were all whites and Blacks, like it or not, were part of the same kind of community, welded together by slavery. And there are a couple of accounts, I won't delve into them in detail, but of freedom seekers on making long overland journeys who were absolutely petrified at encountering Native Americans. I mean, scared out of their boots, because they had in themselves those fears that Americans on the whole had. Okay, complicated subject, impossible to generalize, worth a lot more research. Good question.
There are a number of areas of research that I've been involved in that sort of bring it to a confluence an illustration of a number of things that you talked about. In the so local history, the maritime routes of escape, and the effects of these progressive movements on American history, both before and after the Civil War. In the town of Mystic, where I live. Oh, and the other thing is, of course, the erasure of memory of all this. In the town of Mystic, which is a big tourist community now, that tourism apparently starts with the continuation of that progressive impulse after the Civil War, with the foundation of an annual event called the Universal Peace Gathering that happens just across the river from Mystic Seaport, that would attract up to 10,000 people a year for a week-long gathering with camping across the river there, discussing with speakers from the whole constellation of progressive ideas of the time. So this kind of post-abolition, increasing civil rights for African Americans, Native American rights, the 8-hour day, women's suffrage. They had speakers, all the luminaries you can imagine showed up over the next decades. That meeting continued until 1914 every year, and is really the basis for Mystic becoming a tourist destination. And that political background has been utterly erased from the memory in local history.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, new to me. Thanks.
We're going to close it there. Let's all thank Mr. Bordewich for his work. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes, so 11:15 or so, and we will start our next panel. So take a short break, and we'll be back here in 15. Thank you.